Hi everyone, and welcome to our 6th annual Drugs and Devices Australia webinar. So it's me, Sarah Griffin from MedTechnique Consulting, and my esteemed colleague, George Papadopoulos from Lucid Health. So first of all, I'll present the devices side, and then I'll switch over to George, and we can probably have questions at the end. So let's get started. So if you want to contact us, here are all our details. We're always happy to talk to whoever wants to talk to us. We're available through LinkedIn, our email or our websites. So for those of you who aren't necessarily in Australia, I'll do a quick little setting the scene of the Australian reimbursement system in a very broad brush. So we have a universal healthcare system called Medicare, different from the US Medicare system because it covers everyone in Australia. So nearly half of all Australians also have private health insurance. So they're covered for admissions into private hospitals. So private health insurance in Australia only covers hospital and limited ancillary cover, such as, physiotherapy, dentistry. It excludes primary care and most pharmaceuticals. So consequently, we have a bit of a weird mix of public and private hospital systems. So it would be a bit of a mix of perverse incentives at times, and somewhat fragmented between the state and federal responsibilities. So we're going to concentrate a lot today on medical technologies in private hospitals because this is where all the action has been happening this year. So in order to sell a device into a private hospital, the procedure that uses the device must be on the medical benefits schedule, which is a list of medical procedures and consultations that's subsidised by Medicare. So a procedure must be included on the MBS to be covered by private health insurance. So implantable devices, ones that are put into hospital and stay inside you, such as prosthetics, pacemakers, heart valves, a whole bunch of other things like endoscopic sutures and things like that, they receive a payment over and above any other reimbursement that the hospital may receive, and that they're included on the prostheses list. So consequently, the devices that aren't implanted, that aren't included on the prostheses list, are somewhat at a disadvantage because they're not covered separately by private health insurance and have to be paid for by the hospital. So, Politics 2020, this is a picture of our esteemed Health Minister, the Honourable Mr. Greg Hunt, and this is a picture of the dominated last year, the COVID virus. So fortunately for us in Australia, we've managed very well, and with a few very significant hiccups, such as cruise ships and a whole state having big outbreaks. But overall, Australia's pretty much COVID-free at the moment, so we're quite different from the rest of the world. So consequently, because it's been managed so well, the state and federal governments have pretty much been supported by the population. So initially, private health insurers enjoyed windfalls because elective surgery was pretty much cancelled for several months and they didn't have to pay out for all these procedures. But now those surgeries are being performed and the private health insurers are calling for more reform to reduce their costs, which has been ongoing for a number of years. So their primary focus, which has always been to reduce costs, is prostheses list costs. The insurers view the prostheses list as low-hanging fruit and medical device companies as easy targets, much easier to reduce costs in this area than in hospital costs, which are somewhat reliant on salaries and fixed costs that can't be changed. So this has been going on for a number of years, but the difference this year is that it really does seem to have quite a bit of support from government at the moment for some fundamental change. So along with all the stuff that's happening in the media with private health insurers, there's also a House of Reps inquiry going on. Now, the House of Representatives can be viewed as pretty much as Congress in the US or the House of Commons in the UK. So it's our lower house, and they often conduct inquiries into various policy matters. So the House of Reps Standing Committee on Health is conducting an inquiry into the approval processes for new drugs and novel medical technologies in Australia. Now, it's primarily meant to be focusing on access to technologies and drugs for rarer diseases and things that really aren't being covered at the moment. But the terms of reference are actually quite broad. And the one that's really of interest to those of us in reimbursement is this last one. So without compromising assessment of safety, quality, efficacy, cost effectiveness, whether the approval process for drugs, etc., can be made more efficient, including through greater use of international approval processes, greater alignment of registration and reimbursement processes, or post-market assessment. So basically our system is a bit clunky and a bit rigid, and they're looking at ways to make it a bit more efficient so new stuff can get to Australians more quickly. So the headlines that have been happening in Australia which have been influencing policy, as I said before, private health insurance is really under the pump. They've been reporting losses in profit, and a lot of people have been dropping out of private health insurance because they've been questioning whether it's worthwhile. And with the COVID-induced recession, just a lot of people simply can't afford it. So the health insurers are constantly calling for cuts to prostheses list costs. And there have been significant costs over the last few years, but that hasn't satisfied the insurers, and they do tend to have the ear of government. So it's likely there will be some sort of reform issue. So what's happened this year in prostheses lists? So we had something called the COVID hibernation. So earlier during the year when COVID was at its peak, there was a considerable coordinated reform process going on of the prostheses list. And it was, consisted of industry working groups, of which I was a member of one of them, and it was a very, comprehensive and coordinated process. But that was stopped because ostensibly so that the Department of Health could divert resources to following up on COVID. So basically they stopped new applications for the general and miscellaneous category. So that's stuff that sort of is a bit rats and mice, stuff like sutures and closure devices and things that wouldn't really be considered a traditional type of prostheses. And the hibernation was somewhat selectively implemented by the Department of Health. They were quite happy to take applications to reduce prices, but wouldn't take applications to increase prices. So it was quite, this may be my jaundiced view, but I think they were using the hibernation as to not act on things that they probably could have easily acted on. But overall this year, it's pretty clear that there's been some considerable planning for changes to the prostheses list from the Department of Health and government. So the talk has been to move to the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority to set prices for prostheses. So IHPA, they're the body responsible for collecting all the data that undermines our DRG payment system for public hospitals. So this would be quite a fundamental change. So the move to DRG price setting of devices is possibly likely to be opposed by private hospitals because it's probably not in their interest. and possibly doctors' groups as well, because it has the opportunity to reduce choice for them. And one of the attractive things about the private hospital system, both for patients and doctors, is there's a significant choice of technology that can be used that isn't necessarily available in the public sector. So possibly moving to ARDG price setting would abolish the prostheses list and may create a tendering environment. Now, this is all speculative. There's nothing out, set in stone, but these are the things that are possibly likely to happen. And so it seems, my opinion is, it seems strange to eliminate a key point of difference between the free public hospital system and the private health insurance system when they're having a hard time trying to demonstrate value of private health insurance at the moment. So my prediction, I think, and don't hold me to this, but this is what I think will happen. I think there'll be quite extensive modification of the current prostheses list arrangements, but there'll be a prostheses list remain in some form. But it'll be pretty interesting to see what happens over the next year. So still on the PL, there's been an independent health technology assessment for devices in new categories, or devices requesting higher prices. Initially, when this started, I thought it wasn't a bad process. The Department of Health contracted assessors who conducted an external independent HTA process, and these assessors reported back to the prosthesis list advisory committee. They initially had a fairly light touch approach, which was sort of commensurate with the type of devices that were being included. But increasingly over the last year, I've noticed these assessments have come to mimic a much more full HTA process. And as there's no real published guidelines, it makes it very difficult for the applicant. But still, it's better knowing that this approach is likely and to consider what you want to do when you start a prosthesis application. And it's common with most other Australian HTA approaches, there's very little tolerance of any uncertainty. So I've been mentioning the Medical Services Advisory Committee, or MSAC. So this is the independent committee that determines what procedures get recommended to be included on our Medicare Medical Benefits Schedule, or MBS. So it's a full HTA process, and I just want to go through a couple of little things that I think applicants should be aware of. This is something got a great name called the PICO confirmation, and I want to also talk about contracted assessments. So the PICO confirmation, PICO stands for those of you in HTA, which you'll know, Population Intervention Comparator and Outcome. So this is a document developed by the Department of Health that outlines the clinical and economic questions that need to be addressed in a submission for a new technology to be included on the medical benefits schedule. It takes 6 months from the initial application to get the final document, and you've got to try and manage this process really carefully, because there's a tendency for outcome measures to be included in the PICO that have not actually been included in clinical trials, which can be challenging for applicants. And there's also a tendency for inclusion of comparators that may not be reflective of real practice, and also may not have been included in your clinical trials. So it's really important when you enter this process that you get good advice and you know what you're doing, and you try and manage it as well as you possibly can, because it can be key. So it's really important to get it correct. Everything in the PICO will have to be addressed in your main submission. And if something's inappropriate or not covered by evidence that's included, it's really hard to backtrack. So I wanted to talk about, I just realised I didn't put in about contracted assessment, but I wanted to talk about, you can do, for MSAC, you can do an applicant-developed submission, which means the applicant does it themselves, which we know can be very resource-intensive, or else the department will contract it out for you, which doesn't cost you anything, but the problem with the contracted assessment is you really do lose control of it. So that should be borne in mind before going down that route. So the contract assessments have been of variable quality. We've had recent experience where it appears the assessors have been very inexperienced and have made some quite inappropriate comments. We've realised that new technologies are being held to a higher standard than existing technologies that may be on the list, that have been there for a long time, may not have a really robust evidence base. And even though new technology is the comparator, the new technology is being held to a higher standard. And as I keep emphasising, it's really important to address all the PICO items if at all possible. So another development is the MSAC guidelines review. The MSAC guidelines are currently a big lump of a document, a brick of a document of about 300 pages, I think, that guide the guidelines to completing an MSAC submission. Then, to put it mildly, they're not an easy read. So these are being reviewed. So currently the technical guidelines are separated into diagnostic and therapeutic, but this is being combined in the new guidelines. So overall, they're a really big improvement because they're much easier to read, they're much clearer, the language is simpler, but there's been a few things that I really think are a bit unfortunate. So for devices and medical procedures, as we all know all of us who know who work in this world, evidence available for devices and procedures are really different from those that are available for pharmaceuticals. But the evidence expectations in the new guidelines are clearly just pretty much copied from pharmaceutical guidelines and often really not practical for devices. For example, we all know that many patients can't be blinded to the procedure, and so that always introduces the risk of bias. And sometimes it's really unethical in a device trial to randomise someone to a control arm, particularly for chronic disease, where if you go to the control arm, you're very unlikely to get better. So it's really clear these guidelines have been copied from pharma. Like sometimes during the guidelines they talk about, for devices, they talk about the number of units dispensed per month, which clearly doesn't relate to devices or procedures. So I think that's a bit of a failing. They have introduced a really useful concept of exemplar, which is a fancy word of saying an example. So basically they're saying if there's something similar that you can use that's been approved before, you can have a facilitated pathway. But it's really difficult to see how this would apply in practice because high-risk devices are excluded. And so it's a good concept which should be developed, but it's really difficult to see what actual procedures would actually fall into this pathway so that this facilitated pathway could actually be used. And there's also discussion around the concept of clinical utility, or the benefit that patients receive from outside of the actual clinical effectiveness. So the usefulness that patients receive from the procedure. So this, unfortunately, this is restricted to diagnostics. So they're talking about the benefit that patients receive from actually knowing the diagnosis or knowing that they have a particular gene. But it hasn't been extended to therapeutics, and I think that's a bit of a miss too. So moving on, so that guidelines are going to come into force sometime in 2021. There's no set date. So overall an improvement, but still could have done better would be my grading. So the medical benefits schedule review has been a massive task. The MBS is our, just a reminder, our list of medical procedures and consultations that are subsidised by the Australian Medicare program. So So there's thousands of items on this list, and over the last 5 years they've been reviewed every item has been reviewed and modernised. The goal is to remove things that were outdated and to tighten the criteria for some items and basically bring it up to date. This is now largely complete, and it's actually a real achievement. It had bipartisan support of both sides of politics, and it was a massive task, 100 committees with more than 700 members, and it's pretty much resulted in some areas complete restructuring of the item numbers with really significant changes, and in some clinical specialties been quite minimal. But overall, I mean, it's been a very worthwhile exercise, and it's a credit to Department of Health that they've completed it. So, nearly winding up, my predictions for 2021, and I can't be held to it. I think there's going to be continual pressure on private health insurance as they try and demonstrate their value, and particularly in the wake of the COVID recession, where a lot of people on lower incomes are going to really struggle to pay for private health insurance. So I think there will be concerted efforts to decrease costs, mainly through hospital contracts and primarily the prostheses list. So I think we can expect some significant prostheses list reform or some sort of alternative arrangements driven by the government. Not sure when, not sure how, but I think it will definitely happen in 2021. That's the reason being we could possibly have a federal election next year. In Australia, we don't have federal terms, so the Prime Minister of Australia has the luxury of calling election when it suits them, when they think they're going to win, and the earliest they can do that is August 2021, and I think the latest is about a year later in 2022, and who knows what will happen. Oops. And I think there was a bit of a start to out-of-care options being contemplated by private health insurance last year, but I think that will come more into play this year as there is a drive to reduce costs. Okay, so thank you, and save all your questions till the end, and I'll pass this over to George.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome everybody to our webinar. And as Sarah said earlier, this is our 6th webinar in the series. So, and I think also we hadn't mentioned it before, we always make a video recording of the webinar and our slides available. So for everybody who's taking screenshots, you don't need to do that. We'll be sharing everything. So without further ado, I will continue the presentation. I thought I would start with just reminding everyone that whether it's medical devices or pharmaceuticals, Australia's health system is underpinned by the National Medicines Policy, and that's what's up on the screen at the moment. We can see that there are 4 main objectives to the National Medicines Policy. The graphic on the left, obviously, but you can see it's timely access to medicines, Australians need at a cost that individuals and the community can afford. And that really underpins the HTA aspect of our system, with whether it's medicines or devices. Obviously, medicines have to meet appropriate standards of quality, safety and efficacy, quality use of medicines, but also, especially I suppose from Sarah and my point of view and people on the call, maintaining a responsible and a viable medicines industry. And wrapped around all that, as I said, the HTA remains an important focus for Australia. Since the policy was first launched, I mean, there's been significant changes in our healthcare systems and medicines that have been developed and subsidised. So health services, digital genetic testings, and within the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. And it will be re-looked at, the National Medicines Policy. It's on hold at the moment, but it's a need to re-look at it and bring it up to speed. And also on our slides, you'll see there's sources and links at the bottom, so you can go look at the source documents as well. So there's a lot to talk about in 1 year. I did the last presentation in November of 2019, and if you recall, I don't have the COVID thing anywhere on my slides, but it's clearly impacted everybody, our travel, our lifestyles. So I can assure you, I look back through our slides, and Sarah's and my predictions for 2020 did not include anything remotely related to a COVID shutdown and change the way we do work. And you won't see any predicting slide in my presentation towards the end. I've given up on predicting the future. Sarah's laughing at me. You can't see that. All right. There's a lot happened during the year, and I will focus on a few things as it impacts pharmaceuticals. And there's obviously things on the slides or in the presentation that Sarah and I won't cover that happened, and some people may think it's important. For instance, the R&D tax credit, I won't be talking a lot about that, but it has impact for Australia. But I think one of the big issues from Australia was the budget brought down by our current minister, and we can see that it was quite a generous budget if it actually goes through the legislation. And I think from a pharmaceuticals point of view, one of the key aspects of that was the creation of what's known as the PBS, New Medicines. It's a funding guarantee. The landmark word is from the department, and it's really to carve out or put aside specific funding to meet the cost of future medicines, either new or amended listings. So approximately it's going to be about 2.8 billion in new funding, which is expected to be committed over 4 years to meet the cost of those new medicines and amended listings. I think that's also important to remember. It's not just new listings, but I think there's a commitment from the government together with the industry associations to set aside specific funding for the PBS and pharmaceuticals, which hasn't been the case in the past. And I think that this particular aspect of the budget received quite good reviews. I just want to talk briefly about Medicines Australia and the Generic Biosimilar Medicines Association. I think there's been been a good collaboration over the previous agreement between the two organisations and the Department of Health, and it's again also announced in the budget that there's a commitment to renew these long-term agreements, and which currently expire in 2022, and that's not very far off, as we know, and they take a little while to agree to. So I think there's a good willingness to partner between the industry and the department. As you can see, it's going to be finalised in the next few months. People are working hard at it to continue to provide a good level of certainty for our industry and incentives for investment in Australia, which I think has been lacking in the past. So I think that's a good development throughout the year. The other point I'm going to pivot to and talk to quite a bit is, as part of that agreement with Medicines Australia and the department, there's been a lot of changes and improvements to the PBS process, and so they've been working since late 2017 to deliver on those commitments, and including cost recovery arrangements, which I won't cover the cost recovery arrangements specifically, but basically we're paying for what we get, or we should be. There's been a few stages throughout the process, and I will just talk about probably the 3 bullet points. I won't go through stage 1 because I'm going to refer you to last year's webinar, which is up online, and I think we've shared it as well on email. You can go through that. I'll just concentrate a little bit on stage 2. I think as part of transparency measures, it's been really about the public summary documents. I think there's been good and interesting developments there. And then an update on the medicine status website, which when we talked last year, or presented last year, was a concept that hadn't quite got off the ground, but it is now. All right, so Some of the process improvements in terms of, I think I've already done that one. Stage 2 process improvements include, changes to initial submission categories and introduction of a single submission date. There's been a whole heaps of changes about pathways for submissions, not recommended for the PBAC. I'm not going to go into detail too much of those, and the cost recovery. And I think anyone who's had a go at submitting submissions, has been a lot done with the health product portal that we spoke a little bit about last year. I'm not going to go through that, but I think the departments worked extremely well to get those systems up and running, and I think they're working quite well. So in terms of the public summary documents, you can see there's to the guidelines, a guideline document 7.4, public summary documents about standardisation. You can see from July of this year, PSDs will be subject to this new process, so I encourage you to go look at that particular document. It's quite detailed, but it looks really good and easy to read. You only have, as a sponsor, one opportunity to make redacted requests, and we have to use the new redaction criteria and the ranges, which I'll talk to a little bit in a minute. And so from the meeting that's just happened a couple of weeks ago, November 2020, the PBAC meeting that is, all the PSDs will be subject to the new process and standardised criteria. So it's been updated and finalised, and there's a link to it. But some of the interesting, I'm not going to go through the whole document so you can relax. There's the link at the bottom if you want to go check it out for yourself. But I think some of the interesting thing is the standard ranges for presenting economic and financial information. So you can see from the economic point of view, the ISA ranges and the ISAs per quality ranges have become greater and a little bit more granular, and I won't go through them all there. You can see them, but it goes all the way from dominant to greater than, if your ISA is greater than 1,055,000. So I think from a public's point of view, I suppose from a competitor's point of view, and the PSDs, I think, will become much more informative to help future submissions as well. And then similarly, on the financial side, estimating the financial implications, it will be a little more granular as well. So you can see whether it'll be a net cost saving all the way through to greater than $1 billion a year. And obviously, as per on the previous slide, the qualification is whether that's per year or if it's going to be a combined estimate over a certain number of years. So last year when we spoke, the medicine status website was one of those initiatives that was up and, or not quite up and running, but it was coming. I'm not sure who's had a chance to look at it, but I would urge you to do so. It's quite good. It was launched this year, hence why we're talking about it, 1st of February. If you remember, that's when we were all still blissfully going to Queensland and Maui and planning our skiing holidays for this year, overseas that is. So it was launched the 1st of February. Just sidetracked a little there onto the, I was reminiscing of a better lifestyle rather than sitting in a room giving a webinar. All right, so I urge you to go check it out. I think it's quite a good website that the department's put together with the help of the industry. It includes information on submissions considered by the PBAC from July 2019 onwards. So its limitation is it doesn't go backwards as some of the commercial websites or even the department's, the government's own PBS, PSDs and agendas and so forth. So that is one limitation, but I think the information on it's quite impressive. So just to quickly highlight, you can see on the top left-hand graphic when you get to the medicine's website, it's quite easy to browse. You can look at all the PBAC meetings. They've got 270 records there at the moment. You can search by meeting, by outcomes. Now, if you click on the drug name, for instance, if you come up with one of those ones that you're interested in, the little blue arrow goes down to show you, it's a snapshot. The page is much longer, but I want to just highlight that it's quite easy to navigate and get information, and it's a quite interesting way to present the information along the top in a snapshot of where you're up to. So here, this particular drug information earlier this month, basically got an outcome published and hasn't progressed much further than that. So I think I would highly recommend it. I use it all the time. I think it's a very good initiative on the department side, and it's obviously open to the public and everybody to look at it, and part of that transparency initiative. I also wanted to touch on the Zimmerman inquiry, or it's known by various names, but it's the House of Reps Standing Committee on Health is doing it. They conduct an inquiry into the approval process. And as Sarah mentioned, it's for the title of this is for new drugs and novel medical technologies, which is an interesting title. But when you look at that was Sarah picked up on the fourth terms of reference. But when you look at the actual all four terms of reference, it's quite broad reaching, and so it'll be interesting when the committee actually reports back and what their recommendations are. And I think it's important for everybody to realise how big this review is and has become, and I think will become. And so you can see the four terms of reference are quite broad. You know, the first one's the range of new drugs and emerging novel medical technologies, which can include devices, diagnostics, cell therapy, gene therapy. It says in development in Australia and globally, including areas of innovation where there's an interface between drugs and novel therapies. And then the second one is, as you can see, it goes a little bit further back in the development pipeline about incentives to research and develop and commercialise these new drugs and novel medical technologies, where for the conditions where there's an unmet need. And as Sarah mentioned, orphan drugs, personalised drugs off patent, that could be repurposed. So again, quite broad ranging. I think the third bullet point is interesting from that, just to link it back to the National Medicines Policy about having a sustainable industry and a viable industry, that is measures that could make Australia a more attractive location for clinical trials. And that also includes, I would say, the R&D tax discussions and incentives that are ongoing, again, for new drugs and novel technologies. And so, and Sarah's already highlighted the fourth bullet point, which we all gravitate to because it's got the issue of cost effectiveness and the approval process and so forth, and we'll get to that a little bit as well. So I think it's actually quite large and quite far-reaching. And so when you do look at when you go and look at the website, you can see that over, not over, 162 submissions were provided to this committee from organisations, individuals, and you can search it by number, organisation, individual, state and territory. Sarah and I have poured through all 162 and have written up a summary. No, I'm joking. We haven't, but I would like to. Sarah and I have browsed some of those submissions. I think some of them are excellent. I would highly recommend it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what the committee does with them and how it summarises them and produces its report. So I think stay tuned, and we'll probably come back for our 7th annual webinar next year to probably maybe discuss this in a little bit more detail. All right, I'm going to finish off today on just highlighting a few things about the pharmaceutical industry from the fabulous report from Medicines Australia put out last week or week before about access to medicines. I think they're doing it in conjunction with industry and so forth. and it's really, again, a great report to read to, how Australia's regulatory processes are and reimbursement processes are. And I think you can see the headline there, registration times for new medicines are accelerating. And I think we still seem to be lagging on reimbursement access, especially as we compare ourselves to international standards and the OECD countries. And speaking of the OECD countries, it'll be interesting if our, I suppose, friend and colleague Matthias Cormann gets the top job at the OECD, where he puts and elevates Australia into that organisation, and whether pharmaceuticals or health or Australia's health become a bit more of a focus. But I digress. Good luck to Matthias. So next few slides are just going to present a few diagrams and contents from the report. So again, it's a great report. So I think the TGA registration times have significantly improved. And you can see the graph there, the standard pathways in the dark blue, the priority reviews in the lighter blue, and you can see the average time between the TGA initiates and the ARTG listing, which is what you want to do. I think interestingly too, 6 medicines were put through the priority review pathway, and they were processed in 182 days. And I mentioned Project Orbis last year too, but it's an international work sharing program for Australia, Canada, Switzerland. Sometimes Singapore's in there, sometimes it isn't. And it's supposed to be expediting sharing of information. So the TGA, for instance, doesn't have to write a clinical evaluation report. It can share information. So we've been lucky enough to be involved with one of those Project Orbis products, and have seen it through the regulatory process, and we used that accelerated time frame to submit in parallel to the PBAC. So I can't talk about it at the moment which drug it is, but you'll see it on the agenda at the November, for the November agenda for the March meeting. So the agenda goes public on the 24th of December. So I'm sure everybody will be avidly reading the agenda on Christmas Eve, and the people who do all their statistics will be doing those things. And I think that's a good thing. I think our experience with Project Orbis on the regulatory side and the PBAC side has been positive, and I think it's been a great initiative globally, and it's great to see that Australia has managed to be part of that. In terms of registration times, we are accelerating, which is good, and I think the numbers there for 2019 are not, you can't take too much into it, but if you look at from 2014 to 2018, you can see there's been close to 60% of the medicines have achieved reimbursement within 12 months. Now, that sounds really good, but when you compare ourselves to the OECD, their 60% figure comes in at 6 months. So I think, again, we've got room for improvement. I think that's where the government is trying with the processing, streamlining process, I think together with Medicines Australia and all the working groups to kind of help bring that down. I think we're moving in the right direction, and I think that's a good thing. But as I think I've said before, and I continue to say, there's still further improvement required. I think, our average days are still longer when you compare ourselves. And if you look at the graphic on the bottom, compared to our OECD fellow countries, we're close to 391, and the Union Jack is flown 3 times there, but you can see New Zealand is still worse than us, which is good to see. Hopefully I haven't offended any New Zealanders on the phone on the webinar, but I think that basically the slide says that it's room for improvement. All right. And then finally, I think, everyone asks about registration times for new medicines according to different indications, and does oncology have a better outcome or quicker times and so forth. If you look at oncology and cardiovascular, they do seem to have the longest average listing times, contrast to say some other indications like asthma and arthritis. I also personally think kind of depends on the pricing of those products and the level of evidence. So, and I think that hasn't really been looked at in too much detail. So I just wanted to end on that note, to thank you for listening to us rabbit on a little bit for the 6th time. And Sarah and I thank you both. Thank you both. For the 2 people on the webinar, thank you. On behalf of Sarah and myself, thanks for listening into us again. You know, send us an email, a text message, and we'll stop there talking. And yeah, and I think you guys have been all very good. You don't have any questions for us, so I'm not sure if we've disabled the chat, but the chat's live. Otherwise, I'm happy to go grab a coffee and some breakfast, Sarah. What about you?
Me too.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for logging in and participating. If we don't see you, have a wonderful festive season. Happy New Year. And Sarah and I are committed to doing the 7th in 2021. See you then.